declares there are no limits to his power in a new interview. So with that, we're back in the news center now with the NewsNation political contributor Denise Gitsham and also the political commentator Reese Colbert, who rejoin us. You know, this was I mean, there's a bunch of headlines from Mark Caputo's interview, Denise, in Axios, but this one's picking up a lot of ground. And the president, you know, you always wonder when he's asked about who he's going to compliment, and it's usually these quote-unquote strong men like Xi Jinping. And he talked about Modi in this interview of India, but and then got back into talking about Putin, as he many times does. What about this part of the president's personality, because it impacts how he governs? He says there are literally no limits to his power.
Yeah, it seems pretty consistent with what he's always said. Like, this shouldn't surprise anybody. I don't think that everyone was just sort of taking it, sitting down and saying, well, I really am shocked at what he's saying. He said this back in 2016 when he praised Putin and he praised Xi. And I think that's been the basis of a lot of attacks on him. The thing is, I think that people are sort of missing the nuance when it comes to President Trump. Obviously, he's not trying to be these people. He just admires their strength. And that's what he understands. He understands brute strength. And that's increasingly actually where the tone of our party and also the Democratic Party, really politics in America, has moved towards this sort of, we're just going to win by brute strength, by resistance, by anger, by frustration, more than sort of that thoughtful space that what we're now calling moderates used to occupy, and has come completely out of touch with where the populists are.
Well, I also think the reason these comments now are particularly interesting is because of when he made them, and these questions about whether he's not as all-powerful, even in his own party, as he was maybe even, you know, a number of weeks ago. And, you know, Mark talked to him about that. Here's the president. He seems to not buy into this whole idea that maybe his power is waning. Take a listen.
And that's happening to you.
No, it's not. Fake polls. I have great poll numbers.
How do you maintain?
I would beat any candidate they have by 25 points.
Well, how do you maintain?
I have great poll numbers.
How do you maintain your power going forward? You have the Senate that's rebelling.
I don't think about it. No, I don't think about it. All I do is do my job. You know, I have more than 2.5 years. I have a lot of time. But all I do is think about doing my job.
What do you think, Reese, about this, whether that dynamic is really changing?
I think it's changing, but certainly not to the extent that we need it to change. Donald Trump needs checks and balances. That's why the framers designed this to have 3 co-equal branches of the government. And we've seen Congress and the Supreme Court completely bow to the will of Donald Trump. Sure, he's loosened a grip on some of the people who lost their primaries or are no longer running. But the reality is that Donald Trump is completely in control of the MAGA movement and the Republican Party. There are limits to what that party can do, given the great dissatisfaction that many people in this country have. And even around the world, we're seeing more pushback on Donald Trump's brute force strength. But the reality is that Donald Trump has never had to build coalitions. When he came in the first term, he had a trifecta government. And then when he lost the trifecta, then we saw a completely different form of governance with Speaker Pelosi being really strong in that role. And now he's back again with another trifecta. And so I think the only thing that's really going to teach Donald Trump a lesson about the limits of his power is no longer having a trifecta control.
Well, I don't want to let the Democrats off the hook in this conversation either, Reese. I'll actually stick with you in this regard, because the question is, you know, are they meeting the moment? Are they ready for this? There's this piece of The Atlantic about the Democratic base being angry by Elaine Godfrey that talks about in 2018 there was a top-down resistance, quoting Amanda Littman from this group called Run for Something. That hasn't felt true this time. Instead, the base has led the way, and base voters are furious, partly at Trump, but also at their own leaders. What about the Democrats and whether they're, you know, catering to that angry base or hearing their own angry base the way they should be?
Yeah, I think the Democrats are struggling right now. And I say this as a Democrat in a very busy primary season. I think the primaries have been heavily contested, which brings out a lot of tension and a lot of fighting within the party. And so I think that we're going to continue to see Democrats struggle until there is a clear-cut person heading to the general election for each of these races. That's not going to happen until August at the earliest. And so I think that Democrats are unfortunately getting beat up from within because of the tug about where this party is going and how we're going to have an answer for Trump.
You might be right about that. I'm just thinking about what Denise said earlier about how unpopular members of Congress are, including congressional Democrats, more unpopular than the president. I think there is something to that people just don't like members of Congress and haven't for many, many years. So if that speaks to the power of the presidency, it's kind of easier when you're either in that office or running for that office. But how do you see it, Denise?
Well, I mean, Pew polls recently indicated that only 20% of Americans trust Washington. So, that's the establishment that we're talking about. This is not about a party per se. And of course, as a Republican, I like to point out that Democrats are maybe struggling just a smidge more than we are. But the reality is that's a loss for all Americans. I'm somebody who cares deeply about how well our country is run. I want to win for all Americans, not one American at the expense of somebody with a different letter next to their name. And so when I think about what's best for our nation, what we have now simply isn't. And that's what Americans are telling us over and over. And it's not just in America. I have seen headlines today that talk about how Gen X is going populist in India. And if you see what just happened in the UK, I mean, Keir Starmer is getting destroyed, and all the party dynamics are switching to populist views on both sides of sort of that political divide. So I think what we need to do as Americans, as somebody who really cares and has served our country and wants to see our country and all Americans succeed, is stop looking at comparing, who's doing worse, and try to figure out what can we do better and how can we work together so that we can move our country forward. Because I guarantee you, if Reese and I sat down and talked about what we really cared about and what fires us up, we would be motivated by the same desire to see America succeed, that don't fall into neat talking points on either side of the aisle.
No, you're probably right. And you wouldn't be as far apart as you think. And all of that, I think, is absolutely true. Denise, Reese, thank you both. We appreciate it. Unlimited power, this idea we've been talking about.